So I don't know, are any of you ever thinking about teaching? Okay, because this will be, it'll have a lot to do with that. So one of the things that I'm going to talk about, one, there's a million names in this slide because this is not a solo effort. My research history has been in things that are very theoretical, having to do with computational linguistics. So this is really a departure for me, where I joined this group of 5 institutions, people all over the place, to talk about something that I often make fun of, which is the role of belonging in a community. And so I'm one of these people who's like, oh, you talk about touchy-feely things, I'm out of here. But this is a touchy-feely thing, and but it is something that I think is pretty important. So it has an impact if you do become a teacher, or if you do anything supporting students who are on the edge of a community. So I think that's where the biggest impact will be. So anyway, all these people, all these places, and I'm going to talk about our conceptual model, because this is a full-blown social science model of looking at the role of belonging in STEM education. So you guys familiar with that idea of STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math? And you may have noticed from my collaborators that the schools are of very different size, and it was a mixture between engineering at many of the schools, computer science here at Simmons, and then we had some comparison science groups like biology and chemistry. So let's talk about what I actually did. Let's talk about the conceptual model. There's a conceptual model. This is what you do in social science, is you write a huge conceptual model. Most of our papers that we published on this take little pieces of this conceptual model. So the thing really to look at in this big hairy mess is that lots of things impact whether you feel like you have a connection to a community. And those lots of things you can see can be effective, or a sense of support, extracurricular activities, basically everything on the far left of this slide can have an impact on whether you feel connected. Now our big idea was this connection to a community, or this feeling of belonging in a community, that actually mediates what your academic engagement. So if students feel connected to a community, that will mediate how engaged they are academically, and on the other hand, or not. And it's the academic engagement over there that will actually lead to all these wonderful outcomes that we fret a lot about in STEM education. Now, many people have said that CS and engineering people fret about persistence and retention, and French departments don't. And a lot of people drop out of French. Now, I have no data on that. I just thought, it is true that we're the ones who talk about it all the time. The part that's relevant for Simmons is, regardless of anything else, women are not represented in the pipeline for computer science, and they certainly aren't in engineering. It's actually worse in computer science than it is in engineering. It's actually worse in computer science than it is in physics. So certainly these sort of male gendered identified fields have problems about women and women belonging there. So the question is, why talk about belonging at all? And I've sort of alluded to a couple of things, is that there has been evidence that if you feel like you belong, you're more likely to persist. And one of the first studies, this Seymour and Hewitt in particular, found that engineering students who had a lower sense of belonging would drop out with GPAs equal or above those who stayed. So it wasn't the idea, for many years, sort of this was in the 80s, this was debunked, but for many years it was the idea that you would be weeded out. And there were always famous things that when you were in big science classes, the professor would say, look to the left of you, look to the right of you, 2 of you won't be here. And the idea that we were only getting the best and the brightest. And that turned out not to be true. We were only getting the most stubborn and the people who felt entitled. So if that makes the best engineers, I don't think so. So a lot of research has gone on, not really just on the undergraduate or the graduate level, but it started with K through 12. So here are basically 4 things that motivate us looking at belonging. And all the seminal stuff showed that in K through 12, if you had a feeling of belonging, there was more engagement, more persistence, all of those things. And then it was also found to be true by us in the undergraduate level, but also other people. Oops, sorry, I'm looking at my... and then the other thing is that if you feel like you're connected to an academic community, you have an increasing positive effect and that will lead to persistence, and also you feel like you actually are more technically competent. So this feeling of belonging actually mediates a lot of other things that we know are ingredients to people being successful in these fields. So it's not something to sneer at, as I have done. So no more sneering. So our methods, I'm going to go through our methods pretty quickly, but this was really actually a really great mixed model study with tons of data. As I said, it took part in schools all over the place, 4 different geographic locations. You can see the dots on the map. 5 different places, so some of the dots, there's only 4 dots, but there's 5 institutions, because 2 of them are in Seattle. So can you guess which one we are? Yeah. Now this is something actually, when I started being part of SLIS, I didn't realize that not everyone knew, is Simmons is a women's college on the undergraduate. Yeah. So it's a really different thing. There aren't a lot of us, and it has a huge impact on STEM education, the fact that there were a women's college. So that's us right in the middle. That's our dot over in Boston. The research one, just by the way, is University of Washington in Seattle. That's a place where even if you're accepted to University of Washington, you're not accepted into many majors until, I think, the end of your sophomore year. So it's a gamble if you want to study in a particular field, whether you even apply there. And it is, you know, the teaching load there is possibly 1 course a year for faculty. Their primary emphasis is on research. The faith-based is also in Seattle, and that's Seattle Pacific. It's a wonderful little college by Christian people. I don't even know much about Christian people, so it has different denominations. But it is actually a lovely place. And it's also small to medium. It's on the size of Simmons. Simmons is much smaller than any of them, but it's more on our size. The historically black college and university is actually Tuskegee in Alabama. And it's also a bit bigger than Simmons, but not gigantic. And then finally, the teaching college in the Midwest is in Minnesota. It's Minnesota State at Mankato. And it is almost it's not as big as UW, but it's large. So that's the diversity, a lot of different places. What did we do with these different places, or what did we do there? Oops, sorry, I didn't actually write that. What we did was we gave them surveys. We had interviews with the students, and we observed classrooms. So we basically, looked at the different sites every which way we could. So from our surveys, we have quantitative findings. From our interviews, we have qualitative findings. And from our classroom observations, I guess they're more qualitative-like, but there's an outside observer, so it's a little different than just the semi-structured interview. Otherwise known as a focus group. So, our findings. I wanted to talk about findings that were specific to the relevance for faculty teaching. So, we have 5 sort of soundbite type things. And the first one is that faculty and peer support do correlate to student belonging. So the amount of support, and this is probably not earth-shattering, but we have actually data to back it up to bring it out of sort of the apocryphal, is that if students feel that they are supported by faculty and their peers, they feel like they belong. And it turns out that increases their engagement. And by engagement, I mean just how much effort they put in, how much they participate, and lots of successful outcomes spring from that. And the other thing is that faculty behaviors can actually help this, and that also probably is not a big surprise to anyone, but we actually have a little data on exactly what behaviors. And then of these behaviors, faculty behaviors, that the instruction method itself can actually help this feeling of belonging. And then the last 2 things I'm going to talk about are sort of more tangentially about faculty. They're mostly about the context. And that is that some academic communities, and by that I mean study groups or belonging to a pre-professional organization, can benefit students and others not so much. And then finally, and this was actually I think something that's novel about this research, is that we found that student engagement, how much students engage and participate that lead to improved academic performance, is also supported by non-academic communities. And this actually has been the thing that has changed my teaching the most. But let's get to that. So the first one is the faculty support correlates to student belonging. So basically you can have a local, and by local I mean within the classroom sense of belonging, that will show how the student feels, and it will impact how hard they try and how willing they are to participate. The behaviors, and this is something, oh, this is one of those slides, yeah, that I don't think will surprise any of you, but faculty behavior can really, can really impact how much a student participates. It's not neutral. So if you are encouraging, you being a faculty member are encouraging, it's great. The other quote here, taken from one of our interviews, is essentially the kiss of death. If you discourage students from participating, it doesn't just discourage the single student you think you may have discouraged, it just casts a pall over your entire class. So faculty have to be really careful about whether they're encouraging or discouraging. And faculty behavior is never neutral, and I think that's something to take away. It just isn't. So, so certainly, I think in this big quote, if you have it, if you put down a student, even if every other student in the class is sort of secretly hoping that that student is put down, if the faculty member does it, it will discourage every other student from even opening their mouth. So it's really important to think about how you interact with students. And some of the interaction with students is not just your personal interactions, but it's also how you structure the class. And so we looked at how the class is set up, and we have 3 models. And the first 2 models, the sage on the stage and the guide on the side, are things that people bandy around a lot. Have you guys ever heard these terms? So the sage on the stage, what do you think about? Like what I'm doing right now. So here's where I'm going to have you guys interact. Sage on the stage, do you know what that means? Have you heard this term?
Someone who thinks that they have all the answers and they know everything, and they're presenting their knowledge to the mere students.
Right. And with that is the idea, I say something, goes in the ether, somehow you guys suck it up. So it's this lecture thing. Now, in your courses, think about your undergraduate courses in particular. How were most of the courses? Were many of them this sort of lecture style? What size undergraduate colleges did you guys go to?
I went to a small, really weird one where we had a lot of discussion-based classes.
Mm-hmm. So I'm going to actually get back to that one.
I went to Clark in Worcester, which I think is under 2,000 students.
Yeah,
maybe
it's
1,500.
Yeah.
And again, I was a history major, so it was half lecture and then half discussion for
Yeah.
seminars.
I went to Dave Guy. I'm a non-persistent engineering major.
So let's see if you see yourself in here.
But yeah, I mean, we're about the same size.
Yeah. And your undergraduate?
I went to Bridgewater State College. It's small. I doubt it's 2,000. And my classes were, my degree's in chemistry, so my classes were very intense lecture, but then there was also, the other half was the lab component.
Yeah, and I think you're getting at one thing about institution size plays a role here. You know, when we've done site visits for all of the sites I mentioned, and at University of Washington, it was largely lecture-based. But I have also seen small colleges do a lot of lecture. And one thing I've tried to do this year, and I've failed pretty much, but I'm trying, is take my iPhone and time how little I can talk during the class. And my goal is to actually talk less. Now, certainly students do rebel against this. So the first one, the sage on the stage, is in fact this lecture holly thing. But then we have the guide on the side, which is the other extreme. And this is what has been called the flipped classroom. And I have been parts of different groups at Simmons where professors have tried to flip classrooms. And it is the other side where professors try to speak not at all during class. Not at all, except to say, next group, could you present? And students often don't like that. You know, it means you gotta read the books. And sometimes the books are not good. And also, I think can be a little isolating because a flipped classroom where I mean, it sounds nice, where the professor is the guide on the side, where you're learning and the professor's just to say, well, have you considered looking at this? Or have you considered looking at that? Or have you thought about how these two things interact with each other? That's what the professor should be doing. It's actually really hard to do because what you have is a class of a bazillion students going off on their own pathways, and you're having to guide them all into some way that makes it coherent. A flipped class can often totally flop, where essentially students find themselves just buried under information and unable to privilege any of it, which frankly is what a professor does, is looks at all of the information and tries to privilege it and say, these are the things you should be looking at. So even though a guide on the side, a flipped classroom, can be really great, it turns out to be quite tricky. And it turns out what we found is this last thing we're calling the connected sage on the stage, from our research, turned out to have the same amount of student engagement as a flipped classroom in our studies. Now, the little caveat for that is there weren't a lot of flipped classrooms in our studies because there just aren't a lot of totally flipped classrooms. So if you guys had a class where you would consider it flipped, where the professor does not say really much of anything?
I've had like one class in a course where it's, students are presenting what they read and it's all student-led, but not a whole course that does it.
Okay. Anyone else here at Simmons had a whole course that was flipped?
I took a geology course, just continuing education through Northeastern, and they did most of, we were out in the field, we were doing group work, and that was probably the most successful example of that I've ever seen. I was pretty impressed with that.
And what do you think made that one successful?
The subject matter
Yeah.
lended itself well to that. And the preparation of the professors and the fact that you had a group of students who self-selected to take the class, they're not being forced to. So I think all those things combined.
Yeah, I mean the whole sort of professor working things from behind to make sure students are still engaged and not just waffling around, I think is tricky. Any other, doing one class, that's very doable, I found. It's doing an entire course that gets really hard. Have you had any that are?
So I'm coming from an instructional design background.
Yeah.
So to me, that flipped classroom is, that's a spectrum of interactivity, and the edge that you're describing is kind of like the extreme edge of the flipped classroom. And so having mediated lab experiences where the work is done outside and coming in is definitely much more what I'm familiar with. And yes, I have experienced that from a student perspective as well as from one.
Yeah, and I think it can be really rewarding. So when we found this connected sage on stage, I think that might be somewhere on the spectrum of flipping, where essentially the professor isn't just saying, this is my wisdom and you have to soak it in, but is more in dialogue with students. And we found, I think this is a picture of this going on in a quite large classroom. You can do it in a quite large classroom. The professor is more in dialogue, so the student can't get passive. Frankly, I've seen some UW classrooms where there were students in the back of the class playing computer games. And then I later heard, so I don't know if this is true, but I heard that that's actually a psych out thing that they'll do, is they'll show all the other students that I'm so smart, I don't even have to listen, I can play games this entire time, just to put essentially fear of God and every other student thinking, oh, I don't hit that mark, I'm not so smart. So isn't that awful? In the competitive edge that some schools breed. Not saying that it's always that way at UW, that's the first place I saw it, and I know it happens in other places. So we found that this connected sage on the stage actually had just as much effectiveness in terms of students feeling like they belonged. And this, I believe, is the model that we follow at Simmons more than anything else. Because classes are small, there tends to be more dialogue, but it also just seems to be part of our culture where professors talk and present themselves as partners with students. So, so when our findings bore this out, I thought, yeah, that's what we do at Simmons. Other things that professors should think about are these academic communities. It turns out that of 4 of the 5 institutions we talked about, study groups are really big. Students form their own study groups, that they work a lot together, that they support each other at peers, and one institution does not use study groups. Do you want to guess which one it is? Yeah. This one. Simmons students don't use study groups. So we have, I don't have any findings from this yet, we're doing a little offshoot study called the Simmons story. And what seems to be emerging is Simmons students don't talk to each other, they talk to professors. They go to office hours. They actually will send email to professors, and so they rely much more heavily on outside of the classroom interactions with professors than at any other school, including the two other fairly small schools, which are Seattle Pacific and Tuskegee. So it's not just a big school, small school thing. Simmons really does something very different. So we also found that even in the large schools where almost everyone was in a study group, there were also people who wanted to work alone. And those are what we call the voluntary solitaries. And then there's the preferred solitary. I like voluntary solitary better. And then there's the outsider solitary, the sort of people who would like to be in a study group, but they just feel like they couldn't get into them. Certainly for the person who would like to be in a study group and can't, this is not a good situation. But what we found is most of our Simmons students, so you think Simmons students, they're all women. Maybe they're all women who would like to be in a group, but somehow groups just aren't forming. No, we actually found that many of our Simmons students prefer to work alone, like many of the men at UW. So it's kind of an interesting thing to see our female students patterning with the male solitaries. And at UW, it was true that the outside solitaries were actually more frequently women. So it's a little strange mismatch. I don't know if it says anything in particular about our students or just the context of being in a women's college. But our students tend to prefer to work alone. The other thing we found is that you as a professor can do study groups, or you can set up study groups in good ways and bad ways. And if you do want students to study together, you have to take extra steps. You can't just say, hey, form study groups, because that almost never works well, even when it does work. What you need to do is assign students study groups and have them do particular work together. So you can't just sort of let it happen on its own. And you can't let it really fall to cliques either. That often is fairly poisonous, and those study groups don't tend to work that well. And then the last thing that I think was a really important finding from this study was that non-academic communities actually really did support students. That when we asked students about where do you get your support that helps you be engaged, students talked about family, they talked about teams, they talked about friends, and in some of them we had a faith-based place, of course. They talked about church groups. Actually, and that was true at Tuskegee as well. So they are talking about essentially when things get tough academically, they fall back on support from their families, and that it was really important. And I will say that in terms of my teaching, that's the thing that's changed the most, is when a student has a family obligation or has a family situation that impacts her work, I am much more likely to make accommodations to support that. Understanding that I don't want to be in competition with a family, because that's where they're getting a lot of their support. That's their wellspring. I don't want to say, hey, it's me or your family. Or as one of my professors said in grad school, which is divorce, well, he didn't say it to me. He said it to a friend of mine, Chinese grad student, hadn't seen his wife in 2 years. Wife was coming over to visit. His term was, divorce your wife and marry your research. I'm not giving you the time off while your wife is in the United States. And that, was a pervasive theme. And I think, although no one here at Simmons is that extreme, we often will not be as supportive around students and their family relationships, and I've decided to become more. So that's pretty much our study. I have other things that I can talk about, but basically we have just some suggestions, which I think are all common sense, but I think some faculty don't understand how important they are, which is essentially learn the names of your fine students. Just learn their names, acknowledge them when they come in. When they come in late, acknowledge them. Don't immediately get an attitude if they come in late, because it might be something that they can't help. You don't want to essentially put a wedge between you and your students from things that are purely human factors. And try to, encourage them to see you outside of class. So of course, all of these things are pretty much common sense, but I think because they may go without saying, faculty don't say them, and making them explicit and transparent, I think, is important. The other thing is to talk to students. This is just more things about classroom engagement. This is how you make this sort of connected stage on the stage, which is, again, be very transparent about your classroom choices you make in the classroom. Talk about why you're giving a test on such and such a day. Talk about why you're having discussion. Talk about why you're not giving them the answer when you ask a question, and why you're making them work in pairs and all these things. So to be very transparent about what you're doing and why you're doing it, I think helps. The move around the classroom, have you guys ever noticed that? So I'm sort of tethered to this thing, which I usually am not. I usually do the Oprah thing. And there have been studies saying that the students who pay attention are essentially in this range and just so many feet from you. So you're a little bit outside of my range, but if you actually move around, you'll sort of perk up students. So I essentially usually walk all the way around my classes all the time while I'm talking. Anything else that you've noticed that teachers have done in classrooms that has been effective in keeping you from falling into passivity, which I do when I'm in a lecture. I just sit there and the next thing I know I'm shopping for shoes on my laptop. So anything you guys have noticed that professors do?
I just think it's obvious, who comes prepared and who doesn't, and that makes a big difference.
Who, for the faculty, come prepared?
Yeah, some
Yeah.
come prepared and some are just, let's say, just talking.
Yeah. Yeah, that's all. I have found there's a sweet spot in between being over-prepared, which I used to do when I was a junior faculty member, and a just-in-time teaching where it still feels kind of spontaneous. But then on the other side, there's people who are like, hey, I haven't even thought about this. I'm just going to wing it, which is not good either. You're smiling, so did you? We're thinking of case.
None of them that I want recorded.
Yeah. Okay, so we may have to talk, we'll turn off the recording for discussion. Yeah, and that's also recording. Another, just puts a pall over everything. So yes, so there's other things to think about, but then the one I wanted to get to was this, as I said, out-of-class engagement. Not only not putting a wedge between students and their outside support groups, but also in some ways being part of their outside support group. So the other thing I think that's part of the Simmons story is that, and I don't know much about the graduate schools, but on the undergraduate, we have student groups, we have social events, we get to know our students well enough so that, for example, I had a student whose husband emailed me to say the student was thinking about grad school but wasn't quite sure she could hack it, could I talk to her? And the fact that a student's husband would email me, that's not, I mean, that's one I thought of, but that's not outside of our experience. That we actually get to know not only the students, but often their significant others. And I think maybe that's something that my colleagues at University of Washington can't do, but trying to get to know students as people outside of the classroom, I think really goes a long way to having them know that you care about their engagement. And that's, I think, something that has come out of this study that's really nice. So I think I'm just going to stop by saying all these people supported us.